Perfect. All right, so let's get started with talking about mistletoe. Okay, so just to kind of start off with, what is mistletoe? So, usually we have fake mistletoe that we're putting in our homes for the holidays. And so maybe people don't really realize that these are actual plants. And if you're here in Kentucky and really a large part of the US, actually has different species of mistletoe that grow naturally here. Um, what is mistletoe? So, I know the key word for a lot of people is parasitic, right? We think about mistletoe being a parasitic plant. Uh, it is what we call a hemiparasitic plant. So it's actually not fully parasitic. We do have plants that are completely parasitic in regards to that they cannot photosynthesize at all. They cannot produce any of their own food. And so they rely, just on the host plant. With mistletoe, they actually do a little bit of both. And so they do have host plants where they do derive some of their water, minerals, and sugars from that plant. Um, but then this is still a green plant. It still has foliage where it is able to photosynthesize. It contains chlorophyll pigments where it can photosynthesize and produce its own food as well. So it's kind of getting the best of both worlds, if you will, where it can do a little bit of both. So, what does mistletoe actually look like? So, it has relatively green foliage. There are some species of mistletoe that might have more of a yellowish green color. But for the most part, mistletoe is pretty well evergreen. You're going to see evergreen foliage. And that's something that we're going to talk about how with mistletoe, we're going to see that foliage, especially whenever all the trees lose their leaves, and then we really spot it up there in the canopy. Um, it will also produce flowers. They're pretty insignificant flowers, and so really it's more of the fruit. A lot of times the fruit is kind of, especially our native mistletoe is more of a whitish berry, but there can be some other different colored berries as well. Um, with these berries, they are very much enjoyed by our birds, and that's actually how mistletoe spreads, is that the birds will eat the fruit and then they're going to actually a nice word for it is deposit, but basically they're going to poop out the seeds onto the branches that they are on their trees, where they're kind of roosting, if you will. And so that will help to spur on the germination of those seeds. And so, what happens when a mistletoe seed germinates in the branches of a tree? So, it has, and this is an interesting component of parasitic plants, it has this modified root. It's called a hostorium. Hostorium. And that root is able to actually penetrate even rough surfaces, different tissues. And so it can penetrate the bark of the host tree that it's on. And so it forms this connection to the point where it is able to then absorb water and nutrients from that host tree. Is through that hostorium. So that's where you're getting that parasitic nature from. With mistletoe, this is not a very fast growing plant. It's very slow growing. And so whenever you see clumps of it, excuse me, usually you're seeing a ton of clumps because birds were basically pooping over all of these branches and laying out those seeds. But it's really going to take a while for the plant itself to actually get pretty significant enough for you to really truly notice it. Now, how long can this plant live? Well, that's pretty well dictated by the host tree itself. As long as the host tree is very healthy, um, it can continue to take water and nutrients from it. So it could live a very long time. Now, of course, mistletoe, just like any other plant, could be prone to diseases. Um, it could get struck by lightning. It could also get blown with the wind. But, really, if it has a very sturdy host plant, it's going to do just fine. Um, when the host plant, sorry, let me take a drink of water. When the host plant either falls over or it's chopped down or eventually it just passes away. And so the tree itself is no longer photosynthesizing. Um, Really, then at that point, that mistletoe is going to die, right? It can, or it's going to be a slow death. It's no longer going to be able to take up that water and nutrients. Now, again, mistletoe can still photosynthesize. It may survive for a period of time, but long term, once that host plant is gone, you know, eventually it's going to die as well. So I think the main question here is, do we need to be concerned about mistletoe? Do we need to be concerned that um, it's going to harm our host trees? Because especially here in Kentucky, here in West Kentucky, we do have it. And a lot of us are seeing it right now with all the leaves dropping their leaves, all the trees dropping their leaves. Well, I would say this: if the tree is otherwise healthy and there isn't much of a population of mistletoe in it, it is not anything to be concerned about. However, if there's a tree, kind of like in the picture, that's a lot of mistletoe. Okay. That could cause problems. Okay. When you have a heavy enough population. And especially if you are, say, somebody that's in an orchard, or maybe you're growing nut trees, things of that nature, you may want to cut out the mistletoe from those trees because that could decrease um, the capacity for it to photosynthesize properly, bear fruit. It could significantly stress out the tree. So you do have to watch that. When the population of mistletoe is so significant, you start to see what are called abnormal growths on the tree. And these are what we call witch's brooms, where the branches appear really deformed. And as a result, that decreases the reproductive capabilities, meaning those branches that are deformed aren't going to properly be able to flower and bear fruit or nuts and so on. So you have to be mindful of that. So again, kind of in small amounts, not anything to be concerned about. The mistletoe that we have here that I'll talk about is a native mistletoe. It is found here. It does originate here. It's not an invasive species, an exotic invasive species. But, if you are a commercial tree grower for any reason, you may have to occasionally prune out the mistletoe. And that's going to be the only way you can get rid of it. A spray, anything like that's really not going to make a dent in it because that hostorium is actually taking root, literally taking root in the tree. So the only way you can get rid of it is to prune it out. Okay. So before we go into the mistletoe that we see here, let's talk about some of the different mistletoe families because we do have several families of mistletoe. So, first one I'm going to bring up is the Loranthaceae family. And one thing you'll notice is that mistletoe in general is found primarily in a lot of tropical regions. We do have temperate species, but the bulk of the genera and species that you're seeing in mistletoe are going to be in the tropics. Now, certain families we may see more in the New World versus Old World. With this family in particular, we're seeing it both places around the globe. So with this family, and we'll kind of talk about this a little bit too, these mistletoe families have kind of been revamped a little bit in the past, I'd say 20, 30 years. So they've kind of gone through a little bit of a change. So this might be kind of a little bit older information, but I'll kind of give you some of the updated information here in a bit. But with the genera that's in this family, they still have their basic parasitic attachments. They attach to woody plants. They are generally evergreen. A lot of times the leaves, depending on the type of mistletoe, could be either kind of leathery or scale-like in leaf texture. This is a unique family where in this case, this family of mistletoe actually have large and showy flowers, which is not the case with other families and not the case with our native mistletoe. They're going to be bigger and kind of more vibrant in coloration. Now, I will say still, the reproductive aspect is still the same pretty well across the board with all these mistletoes. They're going to produce fruits that are going to have berries, that are going to resemble berries. They're going to contain seeds. Birds are going to eat the berries and they're going to disperse those seeds. And something that I'll mention too when it comes to that is, especially with our native mistletoe, it's actually very beneficial to birds. It's a good natural food source. And so kind of with that in mind, again, if you kind of have low populations of mistletoe, your plant is otherwise, your trees are otherwise healthy, leave it up because the birds are using it as they need to. So again, just as I had mentioned, it's only when the population gets a little bit out of control that we have to watch it. Okay, so this is where we get some changeover with the families. Originally this family was called the Viscaceae family. This is the true mistletoe. It has since kind of been reclassified into the Santalleaceae family. And the Santalleaceae family is a lot more broad. There's a lot more components to it. So originally this family, which we kind of consider the true mistletoes, which are the mistletoes that we're talking about today, specifically the phorandendrons and viscum that I'm going to bring up here in a minute. They've now kind of been reclassified into this broader family, which is called the sandalwood family. Some of you may be familiar with the term sandalwood. You may know it because it's used in a lot of furniture. It's even used as a fragrance, very common in perfumes and toiletries. That's a much broader family that has 44 genera and over 1,000 species. But to just kind of break this down a little bit easier for you, we're kind of going with the old school family classification because I don't want to include all of those sandalwoods. Those are somewhat parasitic in nature as well, but in particular, we're focusing on actual mistletoes. So with that, with the Viscaceae family, this plant is dispersed both in tropical and temperate regions of both Old and New Worlds. Very much the same. They act almost like a shrub-like nature where they have the hostorium that attaches to the host tree of woody plants. Now, the leaves on them could be either leathery, herbaceous, or scale-like in nature. So they're not all completely evergreen. Um, but with this, unlike the previous family, the flowers tend to be pretty small and inconspicuous. And as I had mentioned, the seeds are still bird dispersed. Bird dispersed. And we're going to talk about both of these genera, the viscum and the phorhodendron, here in a minute. So just kind of stay tuned with that. All right. Um, this family, I don't even want to like even attempt to say the Aramolipidaceae family. I can't say it right. So all I can tell you is that is an old family, and that has been also reclassified into the Santalaceae family. But this was a smaller mistletoe family that was found more in the West Indies and South America. Um, and they also are kind of, same general nature, smaller shrubs. Now, flowers could be either inconspicuous or also showy as well. One family that hasn't changed too much is the Mesodendraceae family. Um, it's one genus, so that makes it easy to kind of understand and learn from. It's one genus with 11 species. Primarily, we're seeing this dispersed across South America and even into Antarctica. Um, and so, really, kind of what I'm getting at with these families and like what I'm trying to showcase here is the distribution of mistletoe is worldwide. Okay. I mean, we do have kind of a heavy part of it, especially Central South America, but we still have species here in the US and in the old world. And so these plants have been used throughout history for different purposes um, in different cultural aspects. And so we're going to kind of get into all of that today. But one thing most of these plants have in common is that they, like I said, are the hemiparasitic and are bird dispersed. Okay, so let's talk specifically about the phorhodendron genus. Okay, so this genus is found pretty much across North, Central, and South America. We have 12 species that are actually found in the US. Now, a lot of them are actually kind of more west, but one that we'll talk about next is one that is found here in Kentucky and part of the eastern US. What are some characteristics? It's the same thing. Mistletoe is actually pretty across the board, very similar. Um, it has relatively dark green leathery leaves. Now, the interesting thing about this genus, they can be monoecious or dioecious. So kind of with that, there could be different species that have both male and female reproductive parts on the same plant, or there are actual separate male and female plants. So just kind of depending there. Um, again, the flowers are pretty insignificant. Um, we may have some pollinators that go to it, but it's really nothing that we're ever going to really notice. With this genus, you're primarily going to see white, pink, or red berries, and they may contain 1 to 2 seeds. Um, with these seeds, like how are birds, like they're dispersed. So, for example, they're dispersing these seeds after they poop them out, honestly. But how are those seeds able to stay attached to the limbs? Well, what a lot of these mistletoe seeds have in common is they have this sticky substance called viscin, and that allows those seeds to stick to tree limbs and stay on there. So then you don't have to risk like a bad storm, wind, rain, running those seeds off of those trees. that sticky material helps them to stay on and then again attach themselves to the tree. So, what mistletoes are actually found in Kentucky? There's only one. There's only one species found in Kentucky. So that kind of makes it easy to know. I think it's pretty well found in about every county, except I don't think for some reason, I feel like Grant County, they said they didn't see any mistletoe in that county, but pretty much found across the state. And so that's phorandendron, serratinum, or leucarpum. So this is where we get scientific reclassification. Um, One of these is kind of an older name versus a newer name. But it's still, both names are still used kind of in both botanical and horticultural industry. And so that's why I want to kind of bring both to you, because you're going to see these used almost interchangeably. Okay, but it's the same one. It's the same mistletoe. We commonly call this oak mistletoe, and that is because this mistletoe is pretty much going to only inhabit hardwood trees. They do prefer oaks, but they will go on other trees as well. Commonly, they will go on maples, black cherries, black walnuts, and other nut trees. Okay. This is really not a species you're going to see on conifers, although there are other mistletoe species, like for example, out west, that will just in particular stay on conifer host plants and not on other tree species. So something interesting to note there. The foliage, again, same kind of information, leathery foliage, simple opposite leaf structure, insignificant flowers, bright white berries. Okay. And again, the birds love that. As I kind of mentioned before, and I'll stress this again, you know, very seldomly is it going to be a problem, especially if it's just on ornamental trees. It's really if you have commercial operations where you might be worried about the mistletoe and you may have to prune them out. So just kind of watch that. Also thinking about, again, how this is very helpful for the birds. You know, the birds do benefit from this, from eating those berries. You may not think of it, but this also can serve as a larval host plant, surprisingly. So we do have caterpillar species that use mistletoe. So one example of this, you probably are familiar with the purple hair streak butterfly. They rely on this. Their larvae will use mistletoe. So kind of another example of how, with this still being a native species, even though sometimes we kind of consider it a nuisance, it's still benefiting our wildlife and insect populations. So that's easy to remember. Really the only mistletoe found here. We'll get into the European mistletoe here in a minute as I talk about this history. So, what's the history of mistletoe? There is a lot of folklore to mistletoe, everyone. Depending on what part of the world you're coming from, there are many different stories behind this. So we're kind of just like scratching the surface here. So with the name mistletoe, there's actually a few different, definitions or, behind this or meanings. The old Saxon version of mistletoe calls it a different twig, referring to the fact that it's on a tree whose twig it does not resemble. So it doesn't look the same as the tree branches. But then also you have other meanings where it could also mean dung on a twig. And that's where people, as you could probably tell, people were observant and they noticed that birds would poop it out and the seeds would go on the would germinate on the twig. So it was called dung on a twig. So yeah, so different kind of ways that actual name of mistletoe is coming from where it's originating. Um, if we look at ancient Greek and Roman history, you all might be familiar with the Trojan hero Aeneas. He had golden boughs of mistletoe, and that served him as protection for and provided him with powers on his different journeys and adventures that he was on. So, this is going back really into ancient times here with mistletoe. So that's just one example. Well, I've got a whole list of other examples, so let's keep going. Specifically, let's talk about the European mistletoe, the Viscum album, that it is distributed in Europe, but we do find it in other places as well now. It's also kind of naturalized in other parts of the world too. This was the mistletoe that was very sacred to the Druid people. Why was it sacred? Because this plant was growing on oaks, and oak trees were considered very sacred to these people. And what was interesting about this is because the mistletoe stayed evergreen through the winter months when the oak trees were dormant, the Druids believed that the life energy, if you will, the life force of the oak tree was being held in this mistletoe plant for the winter months. So little did they know that this is a very parasitic plant that was taking from the tree itself. But in a way, I guess you could say the life force was in the mistletoe because it was taking its nutrients too. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of where that stems from. And so with this culture, they use this mistletoe in different sacrificial rituals. They never wanted the mistletoe to fall on the ground. And so they would actually hang the mistletoe in their homes as a way to bring good luck. So that's another example. So we went into Aeneas. Now we're in the Druids. Let's get into Norse mythology. Okay, we're going to keep going because this is everywhere. If we're wondering where the concept of kissing under the mistletoe came from, this is where we get into Norse mythology. So I don't know how familiar you all are with it. I am not very familiar with it. But there was the goddess Frigga of love and beauty, and she would bestow a kiss upon anyone who walked under the mistletoe. And why did she do that? Because she was doing this as a form of gratitude, because she believed that the mistletoe helped to restore her son from death, like helped to prevent him from dying. So she was thankful to the mistletoe for helping her. And so she would bestow a kiss. Um, Now, kind of with that tradition, the older tradition required that a male was to kiss a female under the mistletoe. And that was, you would only do that when there were actually berries on the mistletoe. Once the berries were gone, and the plant just kind of lost its luster, you were no longer allowed to kiss under it. Okay, so you had a time frame, you had a time limit as to when you could kiss under the mistletoe. Okay, so only whenever the berries were still on it. Once the berries were gone, you couldn't kiss anymore. And we're not done yet. We're going to still talk about more kissing here in a second. Um, but some other beliefs when it comes to mistletoe in Europe was people believed that placing branches of this plant over their house and stable doors helped to keep out witches and other kind of like what they considered evil, supernatural beings. And so they believed that mistletoe helped to keep them safe from that. Y'all probably didn't even realize all this was happening. Um, I'm still not done because we just got to keep going. That's like the fun thing about this class is like mistletoe is coming from everywhere. So all of these pagan rituals, if you will, pagan rituals, eventually, as Christianity kind of dominated the landscape, okay, and overtook the landscape, and people started to convert to Christianity. That's kind of when they still kind of held on to old traditions, but then those traditions kind of changed over time. And so, kind of one of the examples is, initially when we were talking about kissing under the mistletoe, really that was not um, in a romantic nature originally. It was really more kissing as a symbol of friendship. Okay. So, really, it was nothing more than that. But later on, it did kind of develop from there where kissing was more for romantic means, where if you kissed under the mistletoe with another person, then that would lead to marriage. Um, and actually, in parts of England, people would burn mistletoe. They'll burn the Christmas mistletoe on the 12th night so that any boys and girls that kissed under there were spared the curse of marrying each other. They were spared the curse of having to marry that person. So they would burn it. And so then it was null and void. You didn't have to worry about marrying that person. So, and of course, from there, we kind of get into what we talk about today. So, this tradition, of course, originates in Europe as we came over to the New World, to the Americas. The English colonists brought those customs with them. They discovered the native mistletoe that I talked about, the phorandendron. They found this along the coast and in the southeastern colonies. And so they kind of kept the tradition going with that mistletoe because it, was very similar in appearance to what they were used to in Europe. So they kept that tradition going. They would hang mistletoe, except really now and into modern times, when we kiss under the mistletoe, it's, kind of more of a romantic nature, if you will. That may have been like way more information you ever care to know about the history of mistletoe, but that just kind of helps you to break down where this is coming from. Something else that I want to mention as well is other uses of mistletoe, not just for cultural or religious purposes, but medicinal uses of mistletoe as well. So I will say, for the most part, mistletoe is toxic. Okay. You're not going to want to eat mistletoe. It's more mild, but it's not something you want to consume and you just want to be mindful of, like, especially if you are bringing live mistletoe into your home, you want to make sure you don't have pets or children that are ingesting the leaves or the berries. Um, it could cause something very minor when you're handling it, like dermatitis. But then if you're consuming it, you could get something more serious like a seizure. So just be mindful of that, especially if you are actually handling live mistletoe, real mistletoe. But with that aside, again, different species of mistletoe are found across the world. And so they were used for different purposes. So people in Central and South America would actually use tinctures of the phorandendron genus. They would use it as a stimulant, but they also used it as medication for helping with childbirth. Um, Even to more modern times, we have taken chemical extracts, chemical compounds from the phorandendron and viscum genera that we've been mainly talking about. And there have been signs that that could help in treatment of certain cancers and viruses like HIV. So a lot of research that could still be done on these plants. And then even in other places like France, at one time, you know, mistletoe was used to help with lowering blood pressure and other kind of common ailments, if you will. So, really kind of what I'm getting at there is it's across the board, um, different uses of mistletoe. And it's, of course, based on the indigenous cultures that used it at the time. And so we still see some of that, but really not so much anymore. But modern medicine is still looking into kind of extracting some of these interesting compounds in there and using it for different things like possible cancer treatment. So it's really astounding. It kind of goes back to where we don't really think about, we think of this as just a holiday tree, a holiday plant, right? Like, oh, it serves no purpose other than this, but it serves a lot of purposes. It could be used medicinally potentially, and then also it's still beneficial to our insect and wildlife. So very cool in that regard. Um, so with that, we're ending a little early today. I'll take questions here in a second. Before I take questions though, I do want to talk about the next Zoom classes. So we'll take a little bit of a break for about a month, a little over a month, and then we'll come back in January and we're going to do trees. So the whole winter and spring, we're going to be focusing on trees. So each month we're going to talk about basically a different genus of trees. So we'll go into the acers, the maples, then we'll get into, the pines. We'll go talk about ash, hickory. So it's going to be things from where I'm going to talk to you about some of the different species that are found in those genera, but then we'll go into growing conditions, care tips. What are some of the diseases or pest issues that we're seeing with these plants? Things of that nature. So, of course, like for example, in March with the ash, how could we not also cover emerald ash borer? So, that's something that if you all are interested in, then you can just let me know. You can email me or call our office and we can get you signed up for that. So, with that, I'm going to stop my sharing and I'm going to stop the